Okay, get ready because today we're diving into a concept that's a bit of a brain twister but totally fascinating. It's called egocentric presentism.
Yeah, it's definitely a mouthful,
Yeah.
but don't worry, we'll break it down. It's basically a fresh take on an old idea. Solipsism.
Right. Solipsism, the idea that maybe, just maybe, your mind is the only one that's truly real. It's one of those ideas that usually gets tossed aside as too out there. But philosopher Caspar Hare actually builds a surprisingly compelling case around it in his book On Myself and Other Less Important Subjects.
Which is exactly what we'll be diving into today. We'll be exploring excerpts from Hare's book, along with this really insightful foreword by Mark Johnston.
And that's where this whole egocentric presentism thing comes in.
Right. So instead of saying that other minds simply don't exist, egocentric presentism hones in on something we all experience.
Yeah.
The vividness of present experience.
Okay, I think I get where you're going with this. It's like right now I'm aware of the sound of my own voice, the feeling of the chair I'm sitting on. All of that feels so immediate, so much more real than even a memory from a few minutes ago.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. Think about it this way. Imagine you're at a live concert. You got the music, the lights, the crowd. It's an experience that feels incredibly real and immersive.
Totally. There's an energy there that's hard to describe.
Now, compare that to listening to a recording of that same concert later on. You're hearing the same music, but it doesn't quite have that same impact, does it?
Right, it's like there's a certain something missing.
And that something is the quality of presence. It's the difference between something being a memory, even a vivid one, and something being directly experienced in the here and now.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this connects, but does this mean that someone else's experience, like, say, my friend who's out for a run right now, is less real than mine just because they're not here with me?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what Hare is getting at. It's not that other experiences are less real in the sense that they're somehow less valid or important. It's more about acknowledging the unique nature of presence.
Hmm. Okay, so it's not about denying the reality of other experiences, but rather about understanding the difference between something being present and something being, well, not present.
Exactly. Think of it this way. We wouldn't say that historical events, like, say, the American Revolution, are any less real just because they're not happening right now, right?
Right, they definitely happen.
It's just that those events don't have the same immediacy as what you're experiencing at this very moment.
Mm.
And egocentric presentism applies that same logic to the experiences of others.
Okay, my mind is officially bending a bit, which I always take as a good sign on this show. So we've got this idea that maybe presence is what matters, and that it's always tied to an individual's experience at any given time.
And here's where things get really interesting. Because Hare doesn't just leave this as an abstract philosophical idea. He connects it to very real, very human things like self-interest and ethics.
Which seems a little counterintuitive, right? Because if we take this idea seriously, it kind of sounds like we're justifying being, well, self-centered. Like if my pain is the only one that's truly present, why should I care about anyone else's?
You're hitting on a major point of contention, and it's one that Hare tackles head-on. What's fascinating is that he doesn't shy away from this seemingly self-centered implication. He actually argues that it provides a framework for understanding why we naturally prioritize our own well-being.
So it's like it's not inherently selfish to be more concerned about my own headache than, say, the fact that someone's having car trouble a few blocks over. It's just a natural consequence of the fact that at this moment, my headache is the only one that's directly present in my experience.
Precisely. It's not about dismissing or minimizing the very real struggles that others are going through. It's about recognizing that, from the perspective of egocentric presentism, there's a certain immediacy to our own experiences that naturally shapes our perceptions and actions.
Okay, this is all very meta, but I have to admit it's making me think in a whole new way. But I do have to ask, aren't we kind of teetering on the edge of a moral cliff here? I mean, how do we build a system of ethics if we start from the premise that our own experience is the only one that's truly present?
That is the million-dollar question. And Hare definitely doesn't shy away from it. While he acknowledges that egocentric presentism might give us a reason to prioritize our own well-being, he argues that it doesn't mean we should completely disregard the experiences of others.
So it's not a free pass to just ignore everyone else's needs and feelings.
Exactly. And that's where Hare's deep dive into language, logic, and our own everyday intuitions comes in. He uses these tools to build a framework for understanding how we can reconcile this seemingly self-centered view with our very real, very human beliefs about morality and the importance of caring for others.
All right, so we're really diving deep into this whole egocentric presentism thing, trying to figure out how something that sounds, well, kind of self-centered, can actually work with our ideas about morality.
It's a real head-scratcher. And to tackle it, Hare takes us on a fascinating journey into the world of language, specifically how we use words like I and present.
Okay, I and present. Those seem like pretty straightforward words. What's so complicated about them?
You'd think so, right? But let's think about it for a second. When you say I, you're referring to yourself. But when I say I'm referring to me, a completely different person.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's like I is kind of a chameleon. It changes depending on who's saying it.
Exactly. It's relative to the speaker. And Hare's point is that the word present works in a similar way. When you say, my experiences are present, it reflects your own unique point of view. Someone else could say the exact same thing, and it would be true from their perspective, even if what you're experiencing is completely different.
Okay, so my present experience of, say, enjoying this conversation, it's real and valid. And at the same time, someone else's experience of, I don't know, maybe climbing a mountain at this exact moment, that's also real and valid, even though our experiences are miles apart.
Precisely. Each person's experience is like its own little pocket of reality.
Yeah.
And this is where Hare brings in this fascinating concept he calls the logic of points of view. Imagine each person's experience is like a separate movie playing. Each movie is its own reality, but only one can be projected on the screen at any given moment. That's the present movie, the one linked to the I who's having that experience.
I like that analogy. It's like my experience is this constantly rolling film. And even though there are countless other films out there, mine is the only one I'm directly plugged into right now.
Exactly. And this idea actually helps address a major concern people have with egocentric presentism, that it just leads straight to solipsism, the belief that only your mind exists. Hare argues that, yes, while your experiences are the only ones directly present to you, that doesn't mean we should invalidate the countless other movies playing out from other people's perspectives.
So it's about acknowledging the unique immediacy of our own perspective, but not at the expense of denying the reality of other perspectives.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
We're not saying that other people's experiences are any less real or valid, but then the question becomes, how do we actually navigate the world ethically if we're always starting from this place of our own individual experience?
Right, because it still seems like there's a lot of room for self-centeredness there.
Absolutely. And this is where Hare brings in two powerful tools, imagination and empathy. He argues that while we can't directly experience the world from someone else's point of view, we can use our imagination to step outside of our own egocentric present.
So like putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, isn't that what we usually call empathy?
Exactly. Hare believes that this ability to imagine, to connect with experiences that are not directly present to us, is essential for making ethical choices. It's about recognizing the value and importance of experiences beyond our own.
Okay, so instead of being solely focused on my own little movie, I can try to imagine what it's like to watch someone else's film, to connect with what they're feeling, even if it's not my direct experience.
Right. But even with that, there's still this question of conflict, right?
Yeah.
What happens when my needs and someone else's needs clash? How do we navigate that ethically?
Yeah, that's a big one. It feels like we're always bumming up against that in one way or another.
Absolutely. And this is where Hare introduces a really intriguing idea. He suggests that from the perspective of egocentric presentism, there's actually a kind of built-in harmony between acting in our own self-interest and acting morally.
Hold on, are you saying that being selfish is inherently a good thing now? Because I'm not sure I'm ready to go that far.
Haha, not quite.
Yeah.
It's a bit more nuanced than that. But think about it this way. If we accept that each person's experience is the only one that's truly present for them, then when someone acts in a way that benefits their own well-being, they are, in a sense, contributing to the well-being of the only reality they can directly experience.
So it's like by taking care of myself, by pursuing my own happiness, I'm also supporting the only reality that's truly present to me.
Exactly. And here's the fascinating part. Because the same logic applies to every other individual, you end up with this interesting interplay where everyone acting in their own best interest in a way that acknowledges and respects the experiences of others contributes to a kind of collective well-being.
That is a truly mind-bending concept. I'm going to have to sit with that one for a while.
Yeah.
So we've gone from this idea of egocentric presentism, which initially sounded like a recipe for self-centeredness, to this idea that there might be a hidden harmony between individual well-being and collective morality. It's definitely a lot to unpack. Okay, my brain's still buzzing from that last bit. It's like we're saying there might be this weird harmony between looking out for number one and, actually being a good person. But before I get too lost in that, there's one more big piece of this whole egocentric presentism thing I'm trying to wrap my head around. Time. I mean, if only the present moment is truly real, what happens to our sense of self over time? Like, do I basically stop existing every time my attention shifts for a second?
It's a huge question, and honestly, it gets at something really fundamental about how we understand what it even means to be a person across time. And Hare tackles this head on with a concept he calls temporal non-rigidity. It's a mouthful, but stick with me, it's a really cool
All
idea.
right, temporal non-rigidity. I'm all ears. Lay it on me. What are we talking about here?
Okay, so think about how naturally we talk about our future selves, right? Like you might say, I'm going to grab lunch after we finish recording. The I in that sentence, that's your future self you're talking about, right?
Yeah, totally. Future me chowing down on some deliciousness.
But here's the thing. If we're looking at things through the lens of egocentric presentism,
Hmm.
where only present experience has that real, vivid, immediate quality, that future self, the one eating the sandwich, isn't actually identical to who you are in this very moment.
Well, hold on. Are you saying my future sandwich eating self is like a totally different person?
In a way, yeah. What Hare is suggesting is that the word I is less like a fixed label for this permanent, unchanging self, and more like a kind of placeholder.
Yeah.
It's always pointing to whoever is having present experiences, whether it's past you, present you, or future you.
So it's like instead of one me moving through time, it's more like this spotlight that's constantly shining on different versions of myself at different points on the journey.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of temporal non-rigidity. The I isn't stuck. It flows through time, always connected to that immediate experience of the present moment.
Okay, I think I can kind of see where you're going with this, but I gotta be honest, it does make me feel a little unmoored, you know? Like if my eye is always shifting, if it's not the solid thing, then what actually connects it all? What makes me me over time?
That's a really common reaction, and Hare gets that. He argues that even though our past and future selves aren't exactly identical to our present self, we're still deeply connected through two important things: memories and anticipations.
Okay, so even though past me, the one who, full disclosure, almost tripped over the microphone cord a minute ago, that me is gone, like literally gone in this moment. My memory of it, that cringy feeling is still there, linking us together.
Exactly. Our memories are like threads that connect us to those past selves, keeping them alive, at least in a way, in our present experience. And in the same way, when we anticipate something in the future, like that sandwich you're looking forward to, you're creating a link to your future self through that anticipation.
So it's like we're constantly building bridges between our past, present, and future selves through these threads of memory and anticipation, even though the spotlight of the eye is always moving.
Exactly. It's a
Mm.
beautiful way to think about it. And this whole idea actually has some really interesting implications for how we live our lives.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. How does this change things?
Well, for one thing, it encourages us to be a bit kinder, maybe a little more forgiving of our past and future selves. You know how it is, it's easy to get caught up in regrets or judge our past mistakes harshly, but those past selves, they were just as real and present in their moment as we are now.
It's true. They were just doing their best with what they knew at the time.
Right. And just like we wouldn't berate a friend for making a mistake, maybe we can extend that same compassion to our past selves.
That's a really good point. And what about future me? How does this whole thing with temporal non-rigidity apply when we're thinking ahead?
Well, think about how often we make choices that prioritize our immediate comfort or happiness without really considering how those choices might impact us down the
Oh,
line.
I'm so guilty of that.
We all are. But egocentric presentism, it reminds us that those future selves, they're not just some abstract entity. They deserve our compassion just as much as our past selves do, because their experiences, their joys and sorrows, will be just as real and vivid when their now becomes our then.
Wow, this whole conversation has been a wild ride. We started with this almost out there concept of egocentric presentism and ended up with a totally new way of thinking about who we are across time and how to live more compassionate, more connected lives. It's a lot to take in, but in a really good way. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Caspar Hare's work, is there a final thought, a big takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that even though our own experience might feel like the most immediate, the most real thing we have access to, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every I, every experience that's unfolding right now is part of this vast, incredible web of interconnected experiences. Recognizing that, embracing the unique nature of our own perspective while also acknowledging the equally valid experiences of everyone around us, that's where things get really interesting. That's where we find the real richness, the real beauty of being alive.
Beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, from solipsism to the nature of presence to the very essence of what it means to be a self across time. It's enough to make your head spin in the best way possible. If you're as fascinated by these ideas as we are, we highly encourage you to check out Caspar Hare's book On Myself and Other Less Important Subjects. It's a truly thought-provoking read that will stay with you long after you finish the last page. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and remember, reality is what we make it. Or at least, that's our present experience of it.